Welcome back, Buckeye Nation, to the Silver Bullets podcast. I am Michael Citro.
And I'm Chip Minnich.
And boy, Chip, it just, I have to tell you, we haven't talked since Thanksgiving. I love my fall traditions. I love my apple cider, my pumpkin pie, my Thanksgiving dinner, and my annual victory over that team up north.
Did you have a nice Thanksgiving? Because I know last week you weren't feeling 100%.
I did. I muddled through. I even had a beer on Thanksgiving, and I started feeling better a little later in the week and over the weekend, and almost back to 100%. Still a little residual coughing here and there, but mostly back in the saddle. How about you? Did you have a good holiday?
Yeah, and I think I made up for you with you only had the one beer. I had several, so it was a wonderful Thanksgiving, and as you said, that the annual victory over that team up north is just completely made for the best Thanksgiving weekend around.
Absolutely. So let's get right into this, because you and I both, we were in the minority of the Ozone staff picking this game. You and I picked Ohio State to win the game, but we both had our doubts. We both said, this has to be their best effort, and it was their best effort of the season, and rather than being their best effort to win a close game against a very good team, their best effort absolutely destroyed a very good team.
Yeah, I think the narrative on the national scale, and maybe you have a different opinion, it seemed as though leading into the game that the national opinion was it was going to be one of three things. It was going to be that Ohio State won in a close game, Michigan won in a close game, or Michigan won decisively. Mm-hmm. And it would be less than honest to say that there were people thinking Ohio State was going to have a blowout win in the manner and fashion in which they did.
Yeah, I mean, other than the guest picker and maybe Bear on ESPN, I didn't see anybody pick Ohio State. I mean, granted, I don't seek out, the predictions, but everything I saw was all Michigan.
Oh, it was without a doubt kind of the prevailing sentiment was the way that Ohio State's been playing, the way that Michigan's been playing, the struggles that we're all aware of, Ohio State defensively, how supposedly dominant Michigan was defensively. I mean, we could keep going on and on about all the reasons why Michigan was going to win that game. And I think, as you said at the onset of this podcast, we both predicted wins, but we predicted very close wins. I think, if memory serves, you had a 2-point win, I had a 3-point win. Nobody ever thought it was going to come out the way and that it turned out.
And we both vastly underestimated the scoring in this game. We both thought high to mid 20s and unbelievable scoring in this game.
Oh, sir. I mean, let's be honest. What would have given you any kind of indication that Ohio State was going to put 62 points on the board against what was the number one defense at the time? I'm not sure if the national rankings have been updated to reflect, but the number one defense, I'm being completely sincere. I have no idea in terms of where Michigan ranks presently, but going into it, the idea that, all right, you're going up against this stout defense that has a great pass rushers and a supposedly talented secondary. And as we all saw in glorious fashion on Saturday afternoon, it certainly did not come to pass the way that the national media had forecasted.
Yeah, I'm looking at college football stats right now, and Michigan still has the number one defense in the country, despite giving up almost 600 yards and 62 points. I don't know where they rank in scoring defense. I'm sure they must have fallen a little bit there, but it's. The thing was, Ohio State this season has not been able to run the football. You would think against a good defense like Michigan, that's probably going to continue. And Michigan had the best pass defense in the country, so you figure what Ohio State's good at is something that Michigan's good at stopping. And that's really where my trepidation was going into Saturday's game. It was, can Haskins not only can he find receivers against their good defensive backs, can he have time to find them because of their pass rush? And oh my God, Ohio State answered every question resoundingly. I mean, that offensive line played by far its best game of the season. They opened some running holes, probably not as big a holes as maybe in some of the other games, not as consistently, but they did find a way to get J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber 3 yards here, 4 yards there, 5 yards here, and to be able to successfully mix up plays because they could run. They also did a fantastic job in pass protection, even to the point where you weren't really sure what was going on with the pass rush, and you didn't even notice when they blitzed sometimes because they weren't getting any pressure on Dwayne Haskins. He had, I mean, you think back to the Johnny Dixon touchdown, and what did he have, 6 seconds?
Oh, easily. I mean, I didn't have a stopwatch on it, but you're absolutely correct. I think Gerd had it at best when he, in one of the articles for the Ozone, he said something about how the performance of the Ohio State offensive line, how well they protected Dwayne Haskins on Saturday, when 1950s teachers talk about somebody having perfect posture because Haskins wasn't even close. I might have the stats line wrong. I know that Ohio State did not suffer any sacks, and I'm not sure if Michigan registered any quarterback hurries. I know that I'm not trying to minimize the fact that there were times where Haskins threw the ball, and I'm sure that he, after like a step or so, that the defender touched him.
Mm-hmm.
But my point being is, I mean, he was able to get the pass off without really feeling any true pressure, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm looking at the game stats right now, and I see no quarterback hurries. There were 2 pass breakups, and they had 4 tackles for loss, but they were very minimal losses on those tackles for loss. Those were all in running situations. I think even one of them was a quarterback run. And, when I think there were only 2 or 3 times that you did see Haskins sort of get flushed a little bit, but he didn't have anything, and he took off running, and he made positive yards out of it. So, again, we see Dwayne Haskins continue to develop as a runner, which is, I mean, this is literally, and I know people overuse the word literally nowadays, literally a 2-week phenomenon.
Oh, and one of the things that you mentioned about Dwayne Haskins running, I'm not sure precisely where it was within the entire play-by-play, but it was within the game itself. There was a time when Dwayne Haskins dropped back to pass, and I can picture the play in my mind. It wasn't. I know we're going to talk about like the idea of the targeting call that wasn't called. But there was a pass play where when he dropped back and he saw that the middle was wide open and he took off running and slid for positive yardage. That, to me, is kind of emblematic of what I thought Dwayne Haskins was going to be like the entire season, and it's finally coming to fruition right when Ohio State needs it the most at the end of the season against their biggest rival.
Dwayne said something in the postgame about running the ball and how he wanted to get better as a leader, and one of the ways that he thought he could get better as a leader was to be able to improve his running game. And we kicked around the idea earlier in the year that maybe he's getting some advice about running, or rather not running, to protect his investment in the future at the next level. And not that we suggested that was happening, we just suggested that possibly that was a logical explanation for why he suddenly couldn't run after showing us he could run. And there was no hesitation the last 2 weeks. He was all in, and he executed pretty well. In fact, I mean, you could argue on Saturday he ran the zone read better than Tate Martell did.
Oh, certainly. It was, if there was a frustrating aspect to this game, and there weren't many, anytime that you can put over 60 points on your most bitter rival, the mere fact that Ohio State, let's face it, out of those points that they scored, they left points on the field. I mean, by the poor execution near the goal line where they had to settle for 3 points rather than a touchdown. And that was, and I'm not blaming Tate Martell. The one play stands out in particular where he gave the ball, and if he had kept, he would have scored. Right. But I'm not going to be critical after Ohio State won in a manner and fashion that was so convincing after a season of a lot of frustration that fans have been experiencing. When Ohio State was expected to lose, they came up so big against their biggest rival.
They really did. And, if not for one backwards run that Mike Weber had, he would have had 100 yards rushing. The receivers did a fantastic job. Paris Campbell was outstanding. Chris Olave, obviously, his coming out party, and we'll get into his game as well. But everything Ohio State did, the scheme was good. They, I thought there were times when they ran on first down a few too many times, but other than that, I thought the play calling was pretty good. I would have liked to have seen a pop pass with Tate Martell just to show Michigan something that has not been on film. But it was good. I mean, a masterful job of game planning for on the offensive side. The defense, obviously, Michigan does on offense what, as Gerd has mentioned in a number of places, both in his writings and on his podcast, that plays into what Ohio State does well as a defense. And the special teams, I mean, even Greg Schiano coming up with a new punt block that actually worked on Saturday. So all three phases of the game, the coaching staff did an excellent job. You can criticize them all you want for the bulk of this season, and certainly they're not above that criticism, but they really, really prepared for Saturday.
And if there was only one negative that came out of the win, and it's truly unfortunate, is that Demetrius Knox at the end of the game, kind of almost when you kind of think, okay, well, Ohio State can get into the victory formation and just take a knee, and they ran the ball one more time, and it was on that play that, one of the very last plays of the game, that Demetrius Knox suffered a Liz Frank injury that is going to keep him out for sure of the Big Ten championship and the bowl game. And that's the only thing that I would say that has any kind of true negative impact upon the game overall. As you said, offensively, defensively, special teams, Ohio State was hitting on all cylinders, and they came up really big in the eyes of the national media.
Absolutely. I was going to ask you that. Do you think, if not for that injury to Knox, do you think Ohio State runs the football and perhaps puts 69 nicely on the board?
It's a possibility, but I respect the fact that as soon as it was decided, let's face it. I mean, Ohio State, they were up by so many that maybe it was a matter of not so much trying to put 69 as much as trying to get Mike Weber the 100 yards, like you said. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't put it past him. I really believe if they truly wanted the 69, even after Demetrius Knox suffered the injury, they would have gone for it, which would have really, I think, the national media is already against Urban Meyer for contrived reasons, no reason to give them a legitimate one. Mm-hmm. So I personally, I mean, like I said, that's the only thing that was unfortunate was Demetrius Knox suffering that injury. But overall, I would like to believe that it was more of let's try and just, run the ball, kill the clock, get into victory formation. We're going to get Mike Weber 100 yards. I think that was kind of all of those different thoughts. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm sure you can recall times where a team was well up and they were throwing the ball into the end zone, and I kind of take some satisfaction in the fact that Ohio State didn't do that at all.
Yeah, no, it was good. I think what was good about this game is that it was the most watched game of the year in college football. It was there were a lot of eyes. All of the voters saw Ohio State, Michigan. All of the AP writers, all of the college football playoff committee, everybody saw this. They saw a decisive win. They saw a win in which an Ohio State mistake that you virtually never see basically put Michigan back in a game they were already out of, and then Ohio State was able to recover from that and put them away again. And they saw a pretty lopsidedly officiated game and Ohio State still. I mean, Michigan had every advantage in this game that they could think of, and couldn't find a way to stay in the game.
I'm glad that you brought up about the lopsidedness of the officiating, because it truly was. I guess that kind of jarred a thought in my mind and yes, the officials made some egregious errors during the course of the game, but I think you would agree with me that Ohio State certainly needs to clean up a lot of the penalties that they self-inflicted mistakes. I believe that they had 12 penalties. That can't continue. I don't care who they're playing. It could be Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game, and whatever happens, regardless of whether the college football playoff or a bowl opponent, those are the kind of things that have been truly aggravating as a fan to watch. A lot of just careless mistakes. I think you mentioned it in your grumpy old Buckeye column. False start penalties, those kind of. I mean, just I know we'll get into it in greater detail, but certainly Ohio State needs to clean up their penalties, and I think even Urban Meyer would acknowledge that as well.
Yeah, the two things they really need to clean up the most: the pre-snap penalties, and which are the false starts, and the pass interference penalties. I mean, there are times when you need to take a pass interference penalty. There were at least two, one on Sheffield, three, one on Sheffield, one on I believe Wade, and one on Arnett, where if they do nothing, the ball's incomplete, and they did grab. There were a couple others, like there was one on Sheffield, which was absolutely not pass interference at all. So
yeah, it was good coverage. I know exactly which one you're talking about.
So and when you consider the fact that Michigan was grabbing receivers every play and not getting called, they even showed Johnny Dixon getting pulled down on one play early in the game. When you consider the way it was called, kind of one directionally, it was something. And you look at it and you go, well, 12 penalties, 150 yards is terrible. Michigan still had 7 for 72, which is a lot, but they did get away with, like I mentioned, some of the grabbing by the defensive backs. They got away with, of course, what could have been a very key ejection for targeting on a sliding defenseless quarterback who had given himself up, which an Ohio State player did that, he'd be tossed. And and that was a 30-yard swing because Urban Meyer ran on the field, got a 15-yard penalty for it. So, that it could have been a much more evenly called game than it was. And I think penalties played a role in the game in terms of maybe keeping the score where it was, because it's certainly. Let's talk about that call on Malcolm Pridgeon, which ruined a drive, the drive that had started to move, and it all of a sudden you're in second or third and long, and you end up punting early in the game. So that was ridiculous because Chase Winovich was the one who precipitated that contact after the play.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because not that it's going to matter, because not only did Ohio State win, but it's well after the fact that I anticipate Urban Meyer is going to get a phone call from the Big Ten's head of officiating apologizing for that missed call, as well as you said, Noah Furbush, the linebacker from Michigan, who had what appeared, based on every textbook definition of targeting that Ohio State fans have been subjected to over the past few seasons, that certainly seemed like that was an example of targeting. And so I would expect a call of apology for those two, as I said, what I thought were just horrible mistakes. Mm-hmm. I would expect a phone call sometime this week.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the game, the flow of the game. Ohio State got a dream start, 3 and out to start the game, although the first play was an 8-yard run, and you go, but Ohio State took care of business, a sack on the second play, and then stopped third down. They get the punt. They drive right down the field, and Chris Olave introduced himself to Buckeye Nation with a 24-yard touchdown reception from Haskins and made it 7-0 on the first drive. Everything looked good. Michigan responded with a field goal drive. They then got a stop. I believe that was the drive maybe that Pridgeon got the penalty uh, on the second drive, and then they came back down, kicked another field goal, and it was 7-6. And now you're starting to settle into that tight game we kind of expected, and it looked like a bit of a defensive match early on. But it didn't stay that way. Olave got another 24-yard pass from Haskins to make it 14-6. Then it was the Johnny Dixon touchdown to make it 21-6. And now you're thinking it's a blowout. But then Michigan drove down the field and scored with 47 seconds left on a drive aided by penalties, and scoring on a nice catch by Nico Collins over the top of Kendall Sheffield, who continues to have great coverage and yet not be able to break up plays.
Yeah, and when you mentioned about the sack, another player that we haven't mentioned up until this point that I thought had a tremendous game. The first person to actually register a sack was Malik Harrison on that first drive. And we were watching my immediate family as well as my extended family. We were at my sister's watching the game, and my brother-in-law and I were sitting next to each other, and we both thought Malik Harrison, this was without a doubt the best game he's played this season in terms of not only with his play on that sack, but just in terms of his run support. As you said, and I agree with Gerd, that Michigan throughout the course of the game offensively, they kind of played right into Ohio State's defensive scheme perfectly. And it was questionable in the sense that I realized that Michigan, their personnel, they don't have, somebody that's, nearly, they don't have the same kind of personnel that's nearly as explosive as Purdue or Maryland, and the kind of teams that gave Ohio State fits. But it also made you wonder, okay, well, why didn't they try to do some of the things that worked, maybe not necessarily personnel wise, but just scheme wise for Purdue and Maryland? I'm very grateful that Jim Harbaugh and his offensive coaches decided to stick with a heavy run first approach. One of the things, as I said, with my brother-in-law on that, you referenced the idea of that first drive for Michigan when they came down and they kicked a field goal, that was a psychological win for Ohio State, because making them drive the length of the field, and as you know, as I know, as any longtime Ohio State fan knows, in this game, you need to score touchdowns. And it seemed as though Michigan, up until the end, you just referenced the Nico Collins touchdown over Kendall Sheffield, until near the end of the second half, that's what Michigan was doing, is they were driving the length of the field, but they would bog down. Sometimes Ohio State's defense was, regardless of whether it was good coverage or sacks or whatever it might be, or penalties on Michigan. The nice thing about it is, all right, well, they're going to settle for a field goal, and anytime you can force them to settle for 3 instead of gaining 7, it's a win for Ohio State.
Absolutely. I'm glad you called out Malik Harrison. He had a fantastic day. I thought Tuff Borland had one of his best games as a Buckeye, and even Pete Werner made some plays. I mean, he forced a field goal by punching the ball out of a tight end's hands in the end zone. That was very nearly a touchdown. So a big play on that one from him. So all the linebackers chipped in on Saturday in ways that we haven't seen. Now, they weren't perfect, but they were better, and they were just about the level you would expect from Ohio State linebackers on that day. So that was good to see. After Collins scored to make it 21-13, disaster struck. The following kickoff was it was supposed to be fair caught by Demario McCall, who it got into his body, bounced off of him. C.J. Saunders tried to swipe at it, but it bounced over him, and unfortunately ended up in the hands of the Wolverines, and they were able to score on the next play because the Ohio State just absolutely in shock over that play. And then Jim got a little cutesy and went for 2 to try to tie the game at halftime to try to rub Ohio State's face in it. Look, you've been doing all this stuff and you're only tied at the half, and maybe you should be nervous. And nope, they stopped the 2-point conversion, and I think that was another big lift for the Buckeyes, and they still had time to move the ball.
Yes, and give another player who's been maligned fairly or unfairly. Jonathan Cooper was the player who came up with the successful sack on that 2-point conversion. So a lot of those critical Ohio State defenders that we've been waiting for them to emerge, this was the game that they decided to do it, and I'm certainly glad that they did.
Jonathan Cooper would later get another sack and be called for a bogus face mask.
I know what you're talking about.
Where he tickled the underside of the outside of the face mask and did not grab it at all. And for some reason, the referee behind the play, who couldn't possibly have seen a hand on a face mask, called the face mask. He threw the flag. So I don't know. Whatever. It didn't ultimately matter. But Ohio State had some time, came down the field, and looked like we're going to score a touchdown, but then they had to settle for a field goal. So going into the locker room, they led 24-19. So taking a 5-point lead to the locker room on a nice drive that included a nice catch from DeMario McCall out of the backfield. And I was so glad that the Twitterati didn't get their way and have McCall's quote unquote ass benched for the rest of the day, because people are very quick to condemn a mistake, and there's no excuse for a mistake like that. And I got into it with somebody on Twitter about how, hey, it's really no different than dropping a touchdown pass. You don't just bench a player for that. You've got to rely on them and expect that they'll bounce back and execute the next time. If you bench everybody that makes a mistake, sooner or later you got no players on the field. So let him prove himself. If he continues to struggle, then you play him less. But I don't think that was the time to take him off the field and wreck his confidence. Let him go out there and make up for it, and he sure did.
And DeMario McCall, that play, that wheel route down the sideline, throughout the first half, Ohio State kept trying to hit it with Mike Weber. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes not. Mm-hmm. But it was never for big gains. And finally, with DeMario McCall being a little more shifty, a little more elusive than Mike Weber, they not only had that big game, but like you said, DeMario McCall, there was nobody who felt worse about that mistake in that stadium than DeMario McCall. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was very gratifying to see the Ohio State coaches maintain their confidence in a player who is trying to emerge in his own right, giving him an opportunity to make a big play, and McCall came up big, like you said, contributed to what led to an Ohio State field goal at the end of the first half.
It was really the same as earlier in the year when Austin Mack had a couple of drops, and then he was able to bounce back from that and catch a couple balls late in the game to help out with and help Ohio State win. If you don't show confidence in those players and let them make up for the mistakes, then they never get a chance to atone. It doesn't set a good precedent. It just breeds bad feelings and ill will, and I think that they did a good job, and I think they did the right thing by putting him right back out there for the next kickoff. So Ohio State went in the locker room knowing they get the ball back to start the second half. You're feeling pretty good about the way they moved the ball, but they didn't move the ball to start the second half. They end up having to punt right away, and there was a little bit of back and forth in the third quarter. Ohio State ends up tacking on a field goal, and then really started to break the game open late in the third quarter when that man again, Chris Olave, loops inside, blocks a punt. Sevyn Banks catches it in the air, runs 33 yards for a touchdown. And right then and there, you knew when Urban Meyer blocks a punt, good things happen. And you started to feel, you weren't content that the game was over, but you started to feel pretty good right about then.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because as I said, with my family, I immediately made that point that Urban Meyer, anytime that his teams, regardless of whether Ohio State or any of his previous coaching jobs, that anytime that he has been successful with a punt block, he's never lost a game. So even though Ohio State was not completely out of the woods, like you said, it kind of felt like the dam was starting to break, so to speak, on behalf of Ohio State.
I believe that it wasn't too long after that Ohio State got the interception from Jordan Fuller and then scored on the Mike Weber touchdown run. And that was a nifty little play, the little option play on the outside.
I'm sure Kent Graham, wherever he is currently residing, is saying, like, why couldn't it have been that nice and easy for me when I played against Michigan, years ago? But it certainly was. It was not something that I guess you would take to a coaching clinic like Tommy Frazier probably, or Tony Rice or any other option quarterbacks of the past would shake their head in disgust. But hey, whatever gets you, the 6 points, I'll take it. And I was happy to see that Dwayne Haskins, he made the right decision, and Mike Weber was there to be the lucky beneficiary of that decision.
Absolutely. So Ohio State at that point led 41-19 entering the fourth quarter. It felt comfortable, and then Michigan comes down and scores another touchdown on another Nico Collins catch over Sheffield. And I have to admit, of all of Michigan's players on the day, Nico Collins impressed me the most with those catches.
Oh, Nico Collins is something. When we finish up talking about Michigan, he is one of those players that they should feel excited about. We'll talk a little bit more about some of the other personnel, but I agree with you. I think Nico Collins was probably their best offensive player by far in a day that didn't seem to be going not at all too well for the Michigan Wolverines.
Yeah. So, here was Michigan's chance to climb back in it. Really their last chance. They get the touchdown, make it 41-25 because they went for two again and didn't get it. So Jim was chasing points and not getting them. And the 41-25 scoreline lasted all of 16 seconds. Paris Campbell goes 78 yards, originally called a running play, but later correctly changed to a pass. 78 yards, and just gave us yet another one of those photos that we seem to get every year now with an Ohio State player running down the field with a bunch of Michigan Wolverines chasing him. And just really, at that point, I had absolutely no worries in my mind about the outcome of the game from that point on.
I certainly didn't have any worries. If anything, I will freely admit that watching Paris Campbell accelerate from any defender, especially, from the maize and blue, how much I'm going to miss it next year. I can only hope that whatever NFL team Paris Campbell winds up on, that they use him wisely, because I mean, at one point it seems as though once he has that, once he squared his shoulders and turned the corner, that all of a sudden finding this extra gear of speed that it kind of reminds me, I realize, completely different players, but in a similar fashion, Ted Ginn used to kind of almost have that too, just kind of that, okay, I see you're running with me, and now, now we're going to end this because I've got a touchdown to score and I've got a soul to crush from you behind me. So, and just all of a sudden it's done.
Yeah.
And watching it, we were talking about the replays, like on BTN and, on FS1, and just watching, I mean, you can see just all of a sudden this acceleration, and it's just something to behold.
It really is. You're right. It's almost like they go, okay, oh, that's an adorable angle you're taking at me. That has no chance of working, and I'm just going to now beat you by 10 yards. And he just did, and that felt like the dagger to me with 13:55 to play. It wasn't long after that Shea Patterson was banged up, couldn't go. Michigan did end up, tacking on a touchdown with 9:35 to play, but Ohio State comes back and scores the next two. They got an interception of the backup quarterback, and Michigan then gets they did get a garbage time touchdown to make it 62-39. So you could still be mad that you gave up 39 points, but you got a garbage time touchdown. You basically got a free touchdown on the kickoff turnover. So it was about as lopsided a game as I've ever seen certainly in this rivalry.
It was, I guess, just a kind of like a quick side tangent is, I know that when Shea Patterson, when, like you said, he had to leave the game, and I believe I've read online that I think he suffered, some kind of a bruised knee or something, and that he'll be okay, and he'll play in the bowl game, and you never want to see anyone hurt, because let's face it, not only we mentioned earlier about Demetrius Knox, but for example, like Devin Bush,
Mm-hmm.
he had to leave the game. But the question I had is, I know that earlier in the season that the backup quarterback for Michigan was Dylan McCaffrey, and he suffered I think a broken forearm, or I know he broke a bone, I think, against Wisconsin. And at one point, Michigan had Brandon Peters in,
Mm-hmm.
and he has some previous playing experience. Which and then the next thing you know, they had Joe Milton, who's a true freshman, and that's where I'm confused.
Well, they talked a little bit about it on the broadcast about how they get the 5 games now as a freshman without it counting against you if you want a red shirt. And at that point, I think you saw basically the equivalent of Jim Harbaugh throwing the towel in and saying, okay, well, let's put this kid out there and see what he's got. And he looked like he's got some skills. Joe Milton did, and he didn't have a good beginning to his his time on the field, but he did okay from
Yeah,
that
I
point
guess
on.
I guess I could see the logic in that. It just seemed as though, of all places, all right, kid, you look pretty tough. Let's see how you do against, back in the Roman times in the Colosseum. Let's see how you fare against these lions that are coming for you. So it just seemed, I would have guessed that Peters would have been the guy, but you're probably right. It was probably more of an admission of, we're done. Let's just get this. Let's give Joe Milton some playing time.
And here's the thing too. One of the things that I thought tilted this game a little bit for Ohio State in going into this game, and one of the reasons why I thought Ohio State could win, is because quarterbacks in this rivalry playing their first game, their first version of the game, generally don't fare very well. They usually don't. For whatever reason, the moment is bigger, the hits are harder, it's more intense, everything is just magnified. And so, you think back to Braxton Miller's first go around in this, and some of the other quarterbacks in their first go around, some quarterbacks that have been gone on to just fantastic careers, and the first time around is a little different than every time after that. So Shea Patterson going in, I'm like, he's been in some big games, but he's never been in the game. And so I thought that gave Dwayne Haskins a little bit of an advantage. And I think it's a good move by Harbaugh to get Joe Milton in there, because now Joe Milton has played in the game. I mean, granted it was garbage time, but it won't be this monolith out there waiting down the line in his career, because he's already gotten that out of the way.
No, I think you raised some really good points. When we finish up talking about Michigan, that's kind of where I wanted to bring up some things about personnel going beyond this game, looking ahead to 2019. But I can see your point that now Joe Milton, say what you will about next year or the year after that, at least he's had a taste of the biggest stage, the biggest rivalry in all of sports.
Absolutely. Now, 567 yards of offense. Mike Weber went for almost 100, scored a touchdown. J.K. Dobbins, 1 fewer carry, but 50 fewer yards. He had a little bit tougher sledding than Mike Weber did on this particular day. And it's really weird how these two kind of take turns, with one being, having the hot hand and one not. But it was Mike Weber's day, and of course Mike had the added incentive of this being his the school from his home state, and having played against a lot of those guys in high school, and wanting to show them, especially after the guarantee from Karan Higdon, who only ran for 72 yards. Not a terrible average, 4.8 for Higdon, but not as good as Weber's 7.4 per carry. Dobbins only 3.8 per carry. Haskins had 34 more yards after having 59 at Maryland, so he's still doing good stuff. And of course, Haskins with just another enormous day, 396 yards passing, 6 touchdowns. Both of those are records for the game. And of course, he set a new Big Ten record for touchdown passes and passing yards in a season.
Let's just enjoy him while we've got him.
Absolutely.
That's all I can say.
I would say that Donovan is still not the people's Jones, not my Jones. Hashtag not my Jones. Nico Collins had 91 yards receiving. He had a big day. He really impressed me. But you know what? Between Higdon and Evans, each of them had one or two runs that were, decent. Like Higdon even had a 24-yarder, but really they couldn't get untracked. And credit to Ohio State's defensive line for occupying Ed Warner's offensive linemen and allowing some linebackers and safeties to flow to the ball. The thing that Joel Klatt did a good job of pointing out was Ohio State's linebackers were very patient. They didn't overrun. They kind of just sat and waited and waited for those running backs to pick their hole, and then they closed very quickly. And it was really great to see because it reminded me of the way that James Laurinaitis used to play. It's like just come on up and just kind of hover behind that line, and once that guy makes his decision on which way he's going to go, you just accelerate and just basically run through the running back.
Like you said, I think it was a combination of a better scheme by Ohio State as well as Michigan's offensive game plan kind of helping out Ohio State. So the linebackers certainly played far better than what we have seen most of the season.
Paris Campbell had 192 yards, receiving 2 touchdowns. I believe all by himself he had more yards than Michigan averages giving up through the air.
It certainly seemed like it, based on, the way that he was. We already referenced the 78-yard. Was it a run? Was it a pass? I know it was a pass, but it certainly seemed like his influence was felt as an offensive weapon for Ohio State throughout most of the day.
Drew Chrisman only had to punt 3 times in the game,
and that's something that I think when you go back to the close nature that I think we anticipated, who would have predicted that? Like that Drew Chrisman would have, I'm not saying that you could have given him the day off, but I'm just saying that who would have anticipated Drew Chrisman would only punt 3 times?
Yeah, it was amazing. Tough Borland led all players with 10 tackles. Fuller had 8. Malik Harrison had 7, including a sack, 2 tackles for loss. Fuller also had an interception. He was also called for pass interference when he had his face mask grabbed. So I'm not really sure why they saw pass interference, but they didn't see his face mask get grabbed. But I guess you see what you want to see. I don't really like to harp too much on the officiating, but I will say this: there is, let's call it an incentive for the Big Ten entering this weekend to have Michigan win this game. The incentive is it gives you your best opportunity for a spot in the college football playoff. There's no guarantee Ohio State wins this weekend and goes to the college football playoff. But if Michigan had won this game and went and won this Saturday against Northwestern, Michigan was definitely in. So I'm not saying it was a conscious effort or any kind of conspiracy, but it certainly helps the Big Ten if Michigan has a better day than Ohio State. And if that seed is planted anywhere in someone's mind, that can certainly affect the results.
As I said, I think the penalties on Ohio State need to be cleaned up, regardless of whether we're talking this game or throughout the entire season. Mm-hmm. But absolutely, I will contend that I said it before, and I'll just reiterate it. I think Urban Meyer is going to get a phone call apologizing for some of the blown calls, and we referenced Malcolm Pridgeon getting called. We talked about Noah Furbush that should have been targeting, wasn't called. Mm-hmm. Some of the and I think this, some of the self-inflicted wounds you referenced quite correctly, the pass interference calls, that's more of a coaching technique area that, okay, guys, on 3rd down, whatever you do, cover, but don't be, tugging down the field because they're going to, the quarterback, the opposing team is going to just heave it up there. So I certainly think that it's an area of concern, but I truly also believe that the Big Ten needs to kind of, take a moment here and say, we screwed up on a few of these and we owe you an apology.
Right. The pre-snap penalties on both sides of the ball have to be cleaned up. The personal foul variety, those have to be cleaned up for sure. And the pass interferences, those were all problematic. The judgment call ones, that's where I think Ohio State kind of got short shrifted a little bit. But especially, and I will say this, even though Jonathan Cooper got screwed on a face mask call, Michigan got one later in the game. The game was pretty much over by then, but Mike Weber got his face mask brushed, and they made up for that. So I'll call a spade a spade. It was that was not a face mask either. So there were two of those. But Jonathan Cooper's face mask was brutal. That got called. The one against Weber was brutal, but the one that absolutely should have been called, and it should have been both ways. Jordan Fuller gets the pass interference, but he was getting his face mask grabbed. So that should have been offsetting penalties. Redo it.
Yeah, you're right.
So anyway, let's not talk about that anymore. Let's wrap up this thing. Obviously we talked about Chris Olave. We talked about the big day for Dwayne Haskins. He was Big Ten Player of the Week on offense, of course. You set two records. You hang 60 points on Michigan. You're going to get Player of the Week. Chris Olave, not Freshman of the Week. I get it. He had fewer yards than Rondale Moore, had the same number of touchdowns, but he also blocked a punt. So come on, how's Olave not getting that?
Yeah, I mean, just at some point, are we watching the same game? Are we watching the same? Okay, I'm nothing against the old Oaken bucket. I know that but you can't tell me in terms of like the stakes are higher. When you're talking at the time, the number 10 ranked team decided underdog in their home stadium against, as you just said, at the time number ranked 4 team in the country. The winner gets to claim the Big Ten East, go on to Indianapolis, and a true freshman wide receiver scores 2 touchdowns and has an instrumental punt block. And how that doesn't warrant Big Ten Freshman of the Week is baffling.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we know that Chris Olave is a humble individual, and that is he would rather have the win. So he got what he needed, even if he didn't get what we would have all liked him to have had. So one last question about the game for you, Chip. Should Dwayne Haskins have been called for targeting on Brandon Watson?
Why not? Why not?
Because
since no one can really give us a clear definition of what targeting is. Why not?
I mean, because he was targeting Brandon Watson every time he threw the ball for a while there. It was, where's Brandon Watson? Oh, here's a pass for you, Paris Campbell. Where's Brandon Watson? Hey, have a catch, KJ Hill. I mean, they were absolutely picking on Brandon Watson.
Well, that was kind of where I was leading in terms of like my final thoughts on the game, and that is, and again, you and I, we've been longtime fans of Ohio State, and we've been longtime observers of this rivalry, and thinking about it as fairly as I possibly could before we started recording the podcast. In 2015, Ohio State went up to Ann Arbor and they blew Michigan out. And it was kind of the mindset of, okay, well, this is Jim Harbaugh's first year. He doesn't really have his players in, and he's, still kind of building the program. Mm-hmm. And then in 2016, it went into overtime, and that was the anger and frustration that Jim Harbaugh had after that game. From what I've had discussions with, like Kyle Rowland, who is the beat writer for the Toledo Blade, mm-hmm. covers Michigan, that yes, Jim Harbaugh thought that JT Barrett, that he was short on that 4th down call, but the reality is, like, it was probably deep down inside he realized that this was a wasted opportunity to win against Ohio State, when at the time the roster was so much younger in comparison to Michigan's. And then mm-hmm. you look at last year, you go up there as Ohio State, and Michigan has all these injuries at the quarterback position. And so it's kind of like, okay, well, maybe if Wilton Spate had been healthy and Brandon Peters had been healthy instead of John O'Corn, they would have played better. We could have won. So this year, when you think about it, okay, we've got all of Jim Harbaugh's recruits. We've got the number one defense in the country, and they come down and they get smoked. They get 62 points, the most points ever in regulation football history for the University of Michigan is put on them. And that's when you start to look at the players that they're going to lose. Rashawn Gary declared for the NFL draft today. They're going to lose Chase Winovich to eligibility. Tyree Cannell, he's gone. We don't know if Devin Bush is going to declare. We talked about Shea Patterson. He could go if he wanted to, but I doubt that he will. You talked about Karan Higdon. My point being is, all right, they're losing a lot of the key players that were instrumental in getting them to 10-2. And look, they just gave up 62 points. And that's not even counting the fact in 2019, and I'm not going to have this like the dates or anything. Here are some of the opponents that Michigan plays next year. Okay, they play Army. And before you kind of, for the listeners, before you kind of roll your eyes, this is the same Army team that gave Oklahoma all it can handle.
Mm-hmm. Went to overtime.
So that it went into overtime. So that's not a gimme. I think that's early in the season. But they get to go to Wisconsin. They get to play Iowa. They get to go to Penn State. They play Notre Dame late in the season. I don't know how they finagle that one, but I'm not really concerned about it. They play Michigan State, and obviously they play Ohio State. So those are, when you think about it, right there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 potentially losable games.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm saying. It's like, and the talent gap between the two programs, as evidenced on Saturday, is pretty stark. So not that I'm not going to be crying into my pillow, like feeling any kind of sympathy whatsoever, because the 1990s, despite showing my age, are still like very vivid. In my mind, about a lot of the wasted opportunities that Ohio State had. But you have to wonder. I mean, like I heard Rich Eisen, a very proud alum of the University of Michigan. I saw a video clip of him lamenting how, when is it going to happen? Like this is, Jim Harbaugh, like when is he going to do it if he's going to do it at all? So, like I said, it never gets old beating that team up north. I savor every moment of it, but it's the kind of thing when you think back to how dominant Ohio State has been ever since 2001, it's truly something to enjoy and cherish.
Mm-hmm. Noah Furbush, another senior, Zach Gentry. They're going to be missing some guys. Of course I'm sure they'll recruit well, but they are going to get younger. And it remains to be seen if Harbaugh can get, the same kind of elevation from his young players that we've seen from Urban Meyer. Because Urban's teams do this every year, guys. The seniors leave and most of the juniors leave. So, we go through this year after year. Can Michigan survive it when this has long been billed as their best shot to end this streak, and they didn't come close.
Right. Not like 23 points close.
Yeah.
And it could have been, and again, I'm not gloating or bragging. It's going to sound like I am. It could have been worse.
Yeah.
We acknowledge the fact that, okay, if Ohio State, if not for getting a little too cute with the red zone package with Tate Martell, and or if they wanted to at the tail end, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, about possibly going to try and make it an even 70, they could have done it if they truly had made a conscientious effort. So that's the thing. I think that from what I understand, just some of the things I've read online on Twitter, that Detroit radio stations, it's just a mass of misery and frustration. Some of the posts that I've seen on Twitter about, how are we gonna even get close? Like, instead of calling it the game, we should call it the mame or the shame. And they're more than knee deep in misery up there.
Yeah, it's I would say that I feel for them, but I went through the Cooper years, so it was
Yeah,
exactly the
right,
other way. I mean, you and I both lived through that,
right.
and we've seen the other side of this coin. It's not pretty, and it takes something special to break that up. And I will be honest with you, Chip, I did not see this upstart coach from Youngstown State coming in and turning this thing on its ear. I
No,
didn't see that
no,
coming.
no. I mean, even there was a great SI article about how Tressel, he, to his credit, and his wife Ellen made the comment that in the article, that was not something that he had predetermined he was going to say. It was just kind of like the spirit of the moment kind of captured him, and he just felt all of a sudden this moment of pride, standing in front of this basketball crowd when he made that statement. And his wife Ellen in the article said how he's always really good on his feet, and from that point on, I'm sure you can recall that reporters just randomly, even if it wasn't about Michigan, it could have been, that Ohio State was getting ready to play. I don't know, it could have been Michigan State. It could have been Penn State. It could have been anybody that they would ask him randomly, Coach, how many days is it till the game? And he had it that focused, that kind of, and Urban Meyer mentioned it today at his press conference too, that kind of intensity and focus. It's a 365 days a year. It's throughout not only the fall, but it's throughout winter conditioning. It's throughout spring football. It's throughout summer conditioning. It's that kind of attention to detail. But without question, as you said, Jim Tressel was the one. He was the catalyst for turning it completely around.
Absolutely, and we are so very glad that he did. The national narrative seems to be now, from what I've been reading from the national guys, and guys and gals, everybody. Don't want to make it sound like only reading male reporters. The national narrative seems to be, Chip, that Jim Harbaugh doesn't understand today's college football. Here he is using fullbacks and tight ends, and he doesn't understand today's college football or big time college football. When you look at what Oklahoma's doing, when you look at what Clemson is doing, what Alabama is doing, what Ohio State is doing, and to be honest, Alabama hasn't been doing it that long. But I don't necessarily think that any one particular style encapsulates college football. What Mike Leach does is not what Brian Kelly does. What Brian Kelly does is not what Lincoln Riley does. What Lincoln Riley does is not necessarily what Dabo Swinney does, and and on and on. I think there's not one right answer with college football. Look at, you would think that the way Ohio State's defense is, that there's no way they would have got it shellacked by Iowa last year, because Iowa is one of those types of teams, fullbacks and tight ends. But so I don't think that narrative is necessarily right. But the reason I bring it up is this. That's the narrative that's out there right now for Jim Harbaugh. If Jim Harbaugh does lose 2 or 3 games next year, this was supposed to be their Urban Meyer. Their Urban Meyer hire was Jim Harbaugh. Where does Michigan go from here if, for whatever reason, he loses 3 or 4 games next year and suddenly, that narrative has gotten louder and Michigan decides to make a move? Where does Michigan go from there?
I don't know. I mean, that's a legitimate question. I mean, because I don't think you have to necessarily be a former player or former coach at the university, but I think you need to understand the culture. And that's why I'm the best answer I can give you is I don't know, because when you think about the reason, when you go back to after Lloyd Carr, Rich Rodriguez is not a bad football coach. He was just a bad cultural fit in the sense of not only his style of offense and style of defense, but not really understanding the significance of the Ohio State game. And it just never felt right, which is why it didn't work. Mm-hmm. And then they bring in Brady Hoke, okay, former Michigan defensive assistant. He gets it, but he's overmatched just kind of from a tactical standpoint. In terms, you're looking at a guy who had a losing record at Ball State. I mean, he tried hard, and he tried all, like his little takes on it psychologically. Instead of calling Ohio State, he would call them Ohio, and just kind of puzzling things like that. But by the same token, all right, so he's going to call us Ohio, but then he's not going to have the sense to wear a headset and be involved in the play-by-play, even if he's not even calling anything offensively, just to kind of get a feel for the pulse of the game. So to your point, they thought that, okay, here's their I don't want to call him prodigal, but one of their favorite sons coming back, somebody who truly, he was there when he played for Bo Schembechler. His father was an assistant under Bo Schembechler. This guy gets it. And he's been successful at the NFL level. He's been successful at the college level. He's going to get it. Well, the results aren't for $7 million. And I joke about this because I some people that I work with in my day job root for Michigan. I say, hey, instead of taking your team to Italy during spring break, how about you guys work on maybe like some offensive line drills up in Ann Arbor instead? Kind of that, like a little less on the just, I don't want to call them antics, but just kind of a little bit more attention to detail. That I think the recruiting is getting better, but it certainly wasn't where it needed to be to keep pace with Ohio State. And I think that's all they can hang their hat on now, is to try and close the gap talent-wise. I mean, I referenced it earlier, but some of the things that Purdue and Maryland did that frustrated you and I, as well as any other Ohio State fan. Okay, where's the Rondale Moore on Michigan's roster? Where's the Anthony McFarland on Michigan's roster? And the answer is they don't have one. But have they truly looked for it? Like, to your point, have they tried to incorporate some of the things that college football uses more and more of? And like I said, I really don't know where they would go if it turns out not to work with Jim Harbaugh.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have the answer to that either, and I agree with you about basically everything you just said. Rich Rodriguez's problem, most of his problems seem to stem from the fact that he was still recruiting like he was at West Virginia rather than he was recruiting for Michigan. He was going after 3-star defensive backs instead of 5-star defensive backs. He was getting undersized linebackers, undersized defensive linemen. The kind of athletes he used to get at West Virginia are not going to translate to a Michigan. The thing about Brady Hoke was everything seemed forced from him. Everything was like they brought him in and he thought, I'll be the antagonist and call them Ohio. But that just seemed dumb. It didn't seem like, it didn't seem organic. It just seemed contrived. And then with Harbaugh, everything just seems to be a circus. We're going to go to Rome. We're going to go to Paris. I'm going to go climb a tree with this recruit. I'm going to spend the night at this guy's house. I mean, everything seems like a sideshow with him. And I just don't know if that's resonating with some of the athletes that program needs to be bringing in. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, like you said, yeah. Any guy that, say, like Urban Meyer, for all of his detractors, as you pointed out, his record when it comes to rivalry games, his record when it comes to making big plays on special teams, like nobody can question that. I mean, like all of the focus about Urban Meyer and his health, fair or unfair, when people after they've overanalyzed it and played armchair psychiatrist, then all of a sudden the recognition, like, man, that guy can coach. And Jim Harbaugh, it just seems as though it's been, for at least the first 4 years of his tenure up in Ann Arbor, has been more on like the just kind of sideshow behavior, which if that's what you want, okay, take your team to Rome. We'll see you in Ann Arbor in 369 days. Hope you had a nice trip. Maybe you got a nice T-shirt. I don't know.
Well, there was a great college game day sign that said it was like Rome, Paris, with check marks, and then Indianapolis with a big X next to it.
That's creativity right there.
Yeah, as he's taken his teams there, but he hasn't taken them to Indy yet. So another win in the game. We got a few more to go before we even the ledger and
yes,
and make it all square. Granted, they had what about a 16-year or so head start in terms of programs, but Ohio State's catching up. And
Yes.
lately, I mean, if you asked anyone around the country, they probably would have no idea that Michigan actually leads the all-time series based on recent events. I mean, certainly no millennial would believe you, but that's the fact. And Ohio State, we didn't know we would be talking about this last week when we did our show, but we're talking about the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis, and Ohio State being there against Northwestern. And Northwestern team, let me run down some numbers for you, Chip, because they're not going to be impressive. They're not going to sound impressive, but it's all it's kind of a mirage. But the total offense, Northwestern is 111th in the country, 351.8 yards per game. Scoring offense, 108th in the country, 23.7 points per game. Rushing offense, 120th in the country, just 114.8 yards per game. Passing offense, 62nd, 237 yards per game. Total defense, not too bad, 48th in the country, 372.7 yards per game. Scoring defense, pretty good, 29th in the country, 21.7 points against them per contest. Rushing defense is 32nd in the country, not too bad, giving up only 134.7, and the pass defense is way down at 79th, 238 yards a game. These do not sound like scary numbers, but I just want everyone to know that it is all a smokescreen. The Northwestern Wildcats bring you to their level of play. They have a way, of no matter who they're playing, whether they're playing a terrible team or they're playing a very good team, of somehow evening the playing field and making everybody play at that level. So one thing that Northwestern does is the Wildcats are extremely fundamentally sound. Everything they do is executed properly. So if you don't execute properly, it doesn't matter if you're the bigger, stronger player, you can lose that battle. The other thing they do is they just don't ever give up. You can't just ever, if you punch them in the mouth, it's not going to phase them. If Ohio State comes out and puts 2 touchdowns on the board in the first 2 minutes of the game, it's not going to phase Northwestern. They're going to stay in there for the long haul. Ohio State has to play 60 minutes, and Ohio State has to play fundamentally sound football. And above all, Ohio State cannot rest on having beaten Michigan in a very emotional game the week before.
I'm glad you brought up, that it's all a smokescreen, because looking at some of the notes that I had written down about Northwestern, I mean, yes, they're 8-4, averaging 24 points a game. They're giving up about 22, 8 wins. By and large, their largest margin of victory was against Wisconsin, where they won 31-17. But most of their wins have been by 3 points, 4 points. They really, some of the common opponents, for example, they won at Michigan State 29-19. They had to go into overtime but beat Nebraska 34-31. At Rutgers 18-15. Minnesota 24-14. And one of the things to kind of keep in the back of your mind is the Purdue Boilermakers, who beat Ohio State by 29 points in the season opener at Purdue. Northwestern won 31-27. So I completely agree with you. This is, we referenced Jim Tressel, and no, there isn't a Tressel on the staff to the best of my knowledge. But my point being is this is the kind of game that kind of seems almost like a Jim Tressel type team. I have nothing but the greatest respect for Pat Fitzgerald as a coach, considering Northwestern traditionally doesn't get top line recruits because of the academic issues with Northwestern. But the players they get there, like you said, I mean, these guys are just tough. I mean, they don't quit. They're gonna be in it for the long haul. So this is the kind of game that I'll just say it. I think Ohio State, I understand why they're favored, but I'm certainly not anticipating this to be any kind of cakewalk. And I think you would agree with me that sometimes the worst thing for Ohio State is after they have an emotionally satisfying win, like last year against Penn State, then they went out and laid an egg at Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
That, it's kind of that fear, and that there's going to be just overconfidence. It's going to be too difficult to bounce back after a big win over their rival. I'm anticipating an Ohio State win, but I certainly do not believe it's going to be anything easy.
Yeah. Now, Urban used a great word this week when he said after the game, respect. They respect their opponent. They respect the rivalry. And the amount of respect that they have for the rivalry and for the opponent is what allows them to be successful against Michigan. They have to have that same mindset in this game, because they have shown if they don't play their best, they don't bring their A game, anybody, even a very average Maryland team, and even a very average Purdue team, can give them more than they can handle. And Northwestern is fully capable because, like I said, they play you at their level. They just find a way to hang in there, and that's why they have all these close wins. Is because they hang around and find a way to get it done. They just make a ridiculous play at the right moment that you don't expect. Somebody comes free, or they knock a ball out of a running back's hand or something, and it allows them to just get just that one little bit of an edge that they need to win these close games. And that's how they've gotten to 8-4 this year. They've certainly lost some games that you raise your eyebrows at. They got beat by 2 touchdowns against Duke at home. They got beat by Akron. But they also gave Michigan their toughest game prior to other than Notre Dame and Ohio State. So they are capable of playing at whatever level their opponent's at, and that's the thing that makes them a dangerous team. And Ohio State has to show the same amount of respect against this team that they showed against Michigan. They have an experienced quarterback, senior Clayton Thorson, who's completing 60% of his passes. That's very good. He does have a kind of a bad touchdown to interception ratio, but for whatever reason, it never seems to come back and haunt Northwestern too much. He's been around. He's not going to be intimidated. He's not, he's seen a thing or two. So if Damon Arnett's not doing what he needs to be doing, if Kendall Sheffield's not doing what he needs to be doing, he's going to complete passes. He's going to use his tight ends. He's going to use his running backs, and it's going to be a chore to beat this team. And I think Ohio State is in a bad position in the fact that I think they need to win impressively to win the argument against Oklahoma, assuming Oklahoma beats Texas. So, they can't just be going in thinking we need to win this game big. They have to go in with the mindset of we have to win this game. If they execute well, the rest of it's going to take care of itself.
And I completely agree with you, because by the time this game kicks off at 8:00 on Saturday night, they're going to know the results of the Big 12 championship. They may not know by the time the game kicks off the results of the SEC championship, but where I think you're spot on is the time to impress the committee that this game is unfortunately due to the loss at Purdue. Ohio State no longer controls its destiny in terms of being a college football playoff participant. That's just completely it's something that I'm sure it's out there. I mean, unless Urban Meyer has confiscated everyone's phones, and I'm sure that the players, they know kind of the possibility that exists, but all Ohio State can do is play their best and not worry about because they have no control over that. But what they can control is their performance on the field. And you brought up Clayton Thorson. A couple of years ago, Northwestern, they hung tight with Ohio State. Ohio State won, but Clayton Thorson, he referenced on social media today that we know we can play with these guys, basically. And they're not coming into this intimidated. And if there's anything that I realized that Ohio State sold out their ticket allotment, which was not a big surprise. But the fact that Northwestern clinched a couple weeks ago, I saw on social media that they were doing everything that they could to make sure that they had a well-represented student body in Indianapolis for cheering on Northwestern. So I'm anticipating it being kind of split, tell you the truth. I think I don't see it being that Ohio State necessarily is going to have kind of like a home game atmosphere. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe there are more Ohio State fans that are going to be there, but I think Northwestern is going to be well represented just due to the geographic location of Indianapolis from the Chicago area.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, luckily it's also an easy drive for Ohioans to go over, but there's always going to be those certain people from Ohio who are like, well, I'm going to save my money and go to the bowl game or try to go to the playoff if they go to the playoff, that kind of thing. But this is going to be, I mean, for Northwestern, it's like a Super Bowl for them. I mean, this is probably bigger than their bowl game because they've not been in this game before. Ohio State's been here. They know what they have to do, but there's going to be no give up in this team. There's going to be no fear in this team. Pat Fitzgerald's going to have them single-minded. He's going to have them focused. They're going to be ready. They're going to play with a great deal of energy. And like I said, they play fundamentally sound, and they don't give up. Not on a play, not on the game. So it's really tough to put them away. And like you said, Clayton Thorson's not going to be afraid. He's been around the block a time or two. Their running game hasn't been especially scary, but Ohio State's Achilles has been giving up big plays, and they've got a couple of guys that can make big plays on the team. They have some talent, and they got some better defensive players than you would expect, on this roster. So it's going to be a game that, again, I'm just letting everybody know, just prepare for a tight game throughout. Maybe Ohio State will show up focused and energized and play like they did on Saturday, and hopefully they do. But if they don't, you guys like, I mean, Patty Fisher, who's only a sophomore, has been fantastic for this team. Thorson's been a leader. They've got a lot of good players on this team, and Northwestern is a team that can give them some problems. Blake Gallagher has 112 tackles on the year. He's another sophomore linebacker. They have, I think, a very good linebacking core and a very underrated linebacking core. It's going to be tough to run on them.
Oh yeah, well, they're a reflection of their coach, who, I mean, you and I can still, I can still picture Pat Fitzgerald, over 20 years ago playing, even though he was super tough, but athletically, I mean, there was a reason why he didn't play in the NFL. He had I think a cup of coffee as a free agent, undrafted linebacker with the Cowboys, but it's a reflection of their coach, and Urban Meyer acknowledged today at his press conference. They keep everything in front of them. So the idea that Ohio State's going to be able to completely just run past these guys, I think Northwestern defensively, they're going to do everything they can to, as Urban Meyer said, keep the Ohio State playmakers in front of them. Any big plays, I think it wouldn't surprise me that they might get beat, but that they're going to recover nicely and tackle very well. Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. I think it's going to be very close all throughout.
Now, I remember this wouldn't be a bad idea to have Jim Tressel come talk to the team this week. Here's why. Jim Tressel lost in overtime to Northwestern in 2004.
That's right.
From that point on, Jim Tressel punished Northwestern with extreme prejudice every year. I mean, he brought out trick plays. He faked punts. He did like halfback passes. He went for fourth downs he wouldn't normally go for. He hung a lot of points on Northwestern from that point on. He would not be a bad guy to have come out and inspire the troops on how to beat Northwestern, because he took that personally, I think.
I completely agree with you. I remember watching that 2004 game, and little did we know at the time, because that was in 2004, if memory serves. That was a night game up at Northwestern when Northwestern won. And I think it was like the first time since 1971 or something like that. I mean, I could still see the graphic at the bottom of the ESPN ticker watching the game, and little did anyone know that was going to be one of the most mediocre Ohio State teams during Jim Tressel's tenure. Mm-hmm. But I certainly recall in 2005, like you said, going into that Ohio State Northwestern game, kind of some concern, and I want to say it was like 54-10 or something. I mean, it was not even close. That Jim Tressel. I mean, like you said, there was. I liked that term, extreme prejudice. It kind of reminds me of the beginning of the movie Apocalypse Now. But you're right. I think Jim Tressel would be an ideal person to discuss how to handle a team that is as so scrappy as Northwestern.
All right, Chip, it is the moment of truth. What is your score prediction for Ohio State against Northwestern in the Big Ten Championship game at Lucas Oil Stadium?
My prediction is Ohio State 45, Northwestern 28, and I agree with my esteemed co-host that this is not going to be easy. I don't think it's always going to be pretty. I think there are going to be times where it's going to be frustrating, but I do believe that Ohio State, the superior athletic talent and depth, is going to be all the difference in the fourth quarter, and that's why I'm going 45-28.
Got to be patient with the running game. If it doesn't work early, you need to stick with it. Again, this is a defense that's not that far behind Michigan in terms of rush yards per game allowed. So they're good against the run. 32nd doesn't sound awesome, but the difference between top 10 and 32 is only a few yards. So I would say I'm going to say Ohio State 34, Northwestern 23. I think it's going to be an aggravating game against a team that has gotten better as the season's gone on. I think they're a little bit underrated because of those early season losses, and I think that they're going to earn a measure of respect, and Ohio State's going to need to bring it, and they might get punched in the mouth early and have to battle back early in this game. So I think you're right. I think that the deeper team, I think they can wear down Northwestern over the course of 4 quarters, and that's why I think they have to be patient with the run, just like they have been in some of the recent weeks. When it hasn't been there, they've stuck with it, and it's paid off in the fourth quarter, and I think they need to do that again. I think there's a chance that Ohio State could run away in this game, but I'm not going to expect it. I think that Ohio State's going to have to earn every yard, and a week after beating Michigan, that's something that they're going to have to probably come to grips with over the course of the game.
And Urban Meyer acknowledged today at his press conference that over the last few weeks, when looking at the type of games that Ohio State's played, not only talking about, coming off of this game, but coming off the Northwestern game, coming off the Michigan State game, those kind of, the Maryland game, that, these players, and it doesn't matter if we're talking Ohio State, Northwestern, whoever, that these players are tired, and a big concern and strategy that the discussion he's going to have with Mickey Marotti, the strength coach, is making sure that they are properly focused and properly rested, and that they're going into this, because I think that the term you used, aggravating, I think that is, I'm going to try and make a mental note of that next week when we're reviewing this game, that, hopefully, I think you probably hit it right on the head, that we're going to look back at this game as an aggravating experience, but I believe it'll be a positive one, if not an immediately positive one, but a positive one by the time the clock hits 0 in Indianapolis.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for having been there before that will help Ohio State. So that's something in their favor. They definitely have to. They have to know that they're in for a fight for every yard on the field. I mean, Northwestern doesn't have any. You look at their, for example, you look at their receiving core and you go, who sticks out to you? And everybody's kind of around the same average. Everybody's kind of in the same yardage. The top guys, they all have about the same number of touchdowns. It's very plug and play, because all of their guys are kind of the same. I mean, every Northwestern Wildcat is almost identical to every other Northwestern Wildcat, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like I said, if anything, they, just that scrappy demeanor, I'm sure you've heard the expression that a team takes on the personality of its coach. And Pat Fitzgerald say what you will about not being overly flashy, and I know you rattled off all those statistics offensively, but the fact that, okay, yeah, they're not overly impressive, but they get the job done, and they capitalize on mistakes, and that's kind of how Pat Fitzgerald played. So it's no surprise that that's how he coaches and how his team plays.
Right. So we will come back. We will talk about it next week, and maybe by the time we reconvene, we'll have a pretty good idea of what Ohio State's postseason future looks like, and we'll be able to talk about that. And then also, you and I will probably have to powwow about what our sort of holiday schedule is going to look like.
Yeah, because I know that in December, just looking at the calendar, not that I would mind spending time with you, Michael, or our fine fans, but one of these Mondays is Christmas Eve, so we'll certainly have to kind of make some adjustment in terms of the recording of the podcast, if down the line in December.
Right. We have much to discuss. I have a cruise in December also, and I may be moving the last week of December. So
wow. So you're even busier than I thought.
Yeah, there's a lot going on this year. So anyway, good job, Chip. Appreciate you as always, and your comments and your thoughts. It was great talking to you about another win over Michigan, and I look forward to talking to you next week about the Northwestern Wildcats. Let everybody know where they can find you online.
They can find me on Twitter at Chip Minnich. My last name is spelled Minnich. And like Michael, I'm a contributor to the Hayes and Cannon section on ozone.net, as well as a contributor to Athlon Sports.
And please check out all of our stuff from our esteemed fellow members of the Ozone Radio Network, the Sons of Schmidt, the Buckeye Sloopcast, the Buckeye Weekly Podcast. I believe it's Sloopcast on Monday and Friday. We hit the internet on Tuesday, Buckeye Weekly on Wednesday, and Sons of Schmidt on Thursday. And of course, also the Buckeye Weekly does the pregame and postgame. So plenty for you to listen to. And Buckeye Weekly, they also do their stuff on game day on Facebook Live, so you can actually check them out. You can ogle Tony Gerdeman and Tom Orr, and they won't even know you're ogling them.
That's true.
All right, that'll do it. We'll be back next week. Go Bucks!
Go Bucks!